Have you ever looked at a stranger and judged their entire life in a single second? We all do it. But sometimes, the person you look down on is the only person who should be looking down on you. Richard Sterling was a man who thought his bank account gave him the right to treat people like trash. He walked out of a diner after leaving a $0 tip and a cruel note for a struggling waitress named Blake. But he didn't know that the moment he turned his back, his life was over. Because when Blake whispered one single word, "Dad," it wasn't just a question. It was a key that unlocked a 20-year-old lie that would destroy everything Richard thought he owned. This is the story of the wallet, the waitress, and the secret that money couldn't bury. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to erase the city. It hammered against the sleek black windows of the 2024 Mercedes Maybach idling on the corner of 4th and Pine. Inside, the climate control was set to a perfect 70 degrees, and the leather seat smelled of success and isolation. Richard Sterling checked his Rolex, a Submariner that cost more than the building he was staring at. He was 55, silver-haired, with eyes the color of cold steel. He was a man who had built a real estate empire by not caring about sob stories. "Sir," his driver, Arthur, said softly from the front seat. "The meeting with the zoning board isn't for another hour. Are you sure you want to wait here?" Richard stared out the window at the Rusty Spoon, a diner that looked like a relic from a forgotten era. Neon lights flickered with an annoying buzz he could hear even through the soundproof glass. This diner was the only thing standing in the way of his new luxury condo project, the Sterling Heights. The owner, a stubborn old man named Frank, refused to sell. "I want to see the rot up close." "Arthur," Richard murmured, adjusting his silk tie. "I want to see the kind of people who cling to the past, so I can enjoy tearing it down." Richard opened the door, ignoring Arthur's offer of an umbrella. He wanted to intimidate. He strode across the wet pavement, his Italian leather shoes splashing into puddles of oil and grit. He pushed open the heavy glass door of the diner. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere Richard brought with him. The diner smelled of stale coffee, frying bacon, and despair. It was empty, save for an old man in the corner nursing a soup, and a young waitress behind the counter. Blake Bennett was 23, but her eyes held the exhaustion of someone twice her age. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, strands escaping to frame a face that was pretty but pale. Her apron was stained with coffee, and she was frantically wiping down the counter, muttering to herself about bus schedules. "We're closing the kitchen in 20 minutes, Blake said without looking up, her voice raspy. "I didn't ask for a menu," Richard said, his voice booming in the quiet space. He walked to the center booth, the best seat in the house, and sat down, spreading his arms across the red vinyl backrest. "Coffee. Black. And make sure it's fresh, not the sludge you've had sitting there since morning." Blake froze. She looked up, and for a second, her breath hitched. The man in the suit looked like he belonged on the cover of Forbes, not in a dying diner on a Tuesday night. But it wasn't his wealth that startled her. It was the sheer hostility radiating off him. "I'll check the pot, sir," Blake stammered. She grabbed the pot. It was empty. "I'll have to brew a fresh one. It'll be 5 minutes." "Of course it will," Richard sneered, pulling out his iPhone 15 Pro. "Time is money, sweetheart. But I suppose that's a concept that doesn't apply in a dump like this." Blake bit her lip, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. She needed this job. Her mother, Linda, was at home with a respiratory infection that wouldn't go away, and the pharmacy had just raised the price of her inhalers again. Blake had $11 in her bank account until Friday. She couldn't afford to snap back at a rude customer. "I'll get that started right away," she said softly, turning her back to him. As the coffee machine hissed and groaned, Richard watched her. He didn't see a hard-working young woman trying to survive. He saw an obstacle. He saw the kind of inefficiency he had spent his life eliminating. He pulled up an email from his lawyers. "Eviction notice ready. Sign here." He looked at Blake's back. "You know," he said loudly, "places like this are a stain on the city. You're just delaying the inevitable." Blake's shoulders tensed. She turned around slowly. "This place means a lot to the people in this neighborhood, sir." Richard laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Sentimentality is for the poor. Progress doesn't care about your feelings. Blake placed a mug on the saucer with a trembling hand. She wanted to tell him to leave. She wanted to tell him that Frank, the owner, gave free soup to the homeless veterans on Thursdays. She wanted to tell him that this job was the only thing keeping her mom alive. But she didn't. She just poured the water. The next 20 minutes were an exercise in humiliation. Richard didn't just drink his coffee. He weaponized it. Too hot, he complained after the first sip. Blake brought him a jagged cup of ice. Now it's watery, he snapped 2 minutes later. He ordered a sandwich, ate 2 bites, and then pushed the plate away as if it were contaminated. The bread is stale. Do you people buy your supplies from a dumpster? I baked that bread this morning, sir, Blake said, her voice barely a whisper. She was fighting back tears. It had been a long shift. She had walked 2 miles to work because she couldn't afford the bus fare, saving it for her trip home. Her feet were throbbing in her worn-out sneakers. Then you're a terrible baker, Richard said flatly. Check. Blake printed the receipt. The total was $14.50. She placed it on the table with trembling fingers. Thank you, she said, purely out of habit. Richard pulled out a sleek, black Amex Centurion card. He threw it on the table. It slid across the formica and hit the salt shaker. Blake picked it up, ran it, and brought back the slip for him to sign. Richard took out a gold Montblanc pen. He signed his name with a flourish. Richard Sterling. Then, he hovered the pen over the tip line. Blake stood a few feet away, holding her breath. She hated that she cared. She hated that she was mentally calculating if a $5 tip could buy her a sandwich for dinner, so she wouldn't have to eat her mom's leftovers. Richard looked at Blake. He looked at her scuffed shoes. He looked at the fraying hem of her apron. He smirked. On the tip line, he drew a large, aggressive $0. But he didn't stop there. Underneath the total, in the blank space of the receipt, he wrote a note in rigorous, sharp cursive. Service is a skill. You don't have it. Get a real job before this place gets bulldozed. He capped his gold pen, stood up, and buttoned his jacket. He didn't look at her. He just walked toward the door, feeling the rush of power that always came when he reminded someone of their place in the food chain. Blake walked to the table to clear it. She picked up the receipt. The breath left her lungs. The $0 was one thing she was used to cheapskates. But the note, the cruelty of it pierced her exhausted heart. Tears finally spilled over, hot and fast. She wiped them away furiously with her sleeve. Jerk, she whispered. As she wiped the table, something glinted under the napkin holder. It was the pen. The heavy, gold Montblanc pen he had used to write the insult. He had left it behind. Blake picked it up. It felt heavy, expensive, probably worth more than her rent. For a split second, a dark thought crossed her mind. Keep it, pawn it, he deserves it. But Blake Bennett wasn't a thief. Her mother had raised her with nothing but pride and honesty. We may be poor, Blake, Linda always said, but we are clean. She groaned. She couldn't keep it. She ran to the door, bursting out into the pouring rain. The rain was coming down harder now, a deluge that soaked Blake's uniform in seconds. She looked down the street. The black Mercedes was still there, parked by the curb. The driver was holding the back door open, but Richard hadn't gotten in yet. He was on his phone, yelling at someone. I don't care about the environmental impact report, just bury it, Richard shouted into his phone, his back to the diner. Hey! Blake yelled, running toward him. Sir! Richard spun around, annoyance flashing across his face. He lowered the phone. What now? Did I forget to tell you how bad the coffee was? Blake stopped a few feet away from him, shivering violently. Her hair was plastered to her skull. She held out the gold pen. You left this, she said, her teeth chattering. Richard looked at the pen, then at her. He didn't reach for it. He just stared. So? Keep it. Consider it the tip you didn't earn. It's worth $200. Try not to spend it on drugs. The insult was like a physical slap. Blake's hand dropped. She gripped the pen so hard her knuckles turned white. I don't want your money, Blake said, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. And I don't want your charity. I ran out here because it's the right thing to do. Something you wouldn't know anything about. Richard's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, towering over her. Careful, girl. You're talking to the man who is going to own this sidewalk next week. I could have you arrested for harassment. You're a miserable man, Blake said, looking him dead in the eye. You have everything, and you have nothing. Richard scoffed. He turned to get into the car. Arthur, let's go. As he turned, his coat swung open. He reached into his inner pocket to put his phone away, but in his haste and anger, he fumbled. His wallet, a thick, black leather billfold, slipped from his grasp. It hit a puddle with a wet plap. Richard didn't notice. He was already stepping into the car. Wait, Blake yelled. She instinctively lunged forward to grab the wallet before the car could drive away. She picked it up. It was wet, heavy. As she lifted it, the wallet fell open in her hands. She didn't mean to pry. But the plastic insert flap flopped open, revealing a photograph protected by the clear window. It wasn't a credit card. It wasn't cash. It was an old, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman laughing, sitting on a park bench. She had bright, kind eyes and a distinctive, heart-shaped birthmark on her collarbone. She was holding a vanilla ice cream cone. Blake stopped breathing. The rain seemed to freeze in midair. The sound of the traffic faded into a high-pitched ring in her ears. She knew that face. She knew that birthmark. She saw it every single day when she bathed her sick mother. And she knew the other person in the photo. The man standing next to the woman, his arm draped lovingly around her shoulders, looking young, happy, and carefree. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a flannel shirt and smiling a smile Blake had never seen, but recognized instantly. It was the man standing in front of her. Richard was halfway into the car when he realized she hadn't moved. He stepped back out, furious. What is wrong with you? Give me that. He snatched the wallet from her frozen hands. Blake looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, searching his face, peeling back the wrinkles and the cruelty to find the young man in the photo. That photo. Blake whispered, her voice trembling so hard it was barely audible over the rain. What? Richard snapped, wiping the water off the leather. The woman, Blake choked out. Linda Bennett. Richard froze. His entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in the streetlights. He stared at the waitress, really looked at her for the first time. He looked at her blue eyes. His blue eyes. He looked at the shape of her chin. Linda's chin. How do you know that name? Richard's voice was a low growl, dangerous and terrified. Blake took a step back, clutching her apron. She's my mother. Richard stared at her. The world tilted on its axis. He shook his head, a violent denial. No. That's impossible. Linda died. She died 23 years ago. No, Blake said, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She's at home. She's sick. And she has a picture just like that one, hidden in her Bible. Blake looked deep into the eyes of the billionaire who had just humiliated her. Dad? The word hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hand, still holding the wallet, began to shake uncontrollably. The wallet slipped from his fingers again, hitting the wet pavement. This time, nobody picked it up. You're dead? Richard whispered, his eyes wide with horror. You died with her in the crash. What crash? Blake asked, stepping closer. My father left us before I was born. That's what she told me. He just left. Richard looked like he was having a heart attack. He grabbed the door frame of the Mercedes to steady himself. No, I was told. Her sister told me. He looked at Blake, scanning her face desperately. The crash. 2001, Oklahoma City. She said there were no survivors. The ride to Blake's apartment was silent, a suffocating silence that felt heavier than the storm raging outside. Richard sat in the back of the Maybach, his wet coat dripping onto the pristine leather. Across from him, Blake sat on the edge of the seat, hugging her arms, refusing to make eye contact. She looked like a frightened animal trapped in a cage with a predator. "Turn up the heat, Arthur," Richard commanded, his voice hoarse. "She's shivering." "I'm fine," Blake snapped, though her teeth were audibly clicking together. "I don't need your comfort. I just need you to see the truth, so you leave us alone." Richard looked at her. He saw the defiance in her jaw, a jawline he saw in the mirror every morning while shaving. A knot of nausea twisted in his stomach. Could it be true? For 20 years, he had mourned them. He had visited an empty grave in a cemetery in Ohio every year on the anniversary of the accident. He had built a fortress of money around his heart because the only two people he had ever loved were gone. "We're here," Arthur announced, his voice tinged with disapproval, as he pulled up to a crumbling brick building in the shadow of the highway overpass. The building was a sore on the face of the city. The front door was propped open with a cinder block. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and mildew. Richard Sterling, a man who owned penthouses in 3 different countries, felt a wave of shame so potent it nearly brought him to his knees. "If this is my daughter, this is where she has been living?" They climbed the 4 flights of stairs. Blake fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking. "Mom?" Blake called out as she pushed the door open. "I'm home early. And I brought someone." The apartment was tiny. A single room served as the kitchen and living area, with a curtain separating the bedroom. It was meticulously clean, but heartbreakingly poor. Paint peeled from the ceiling like dead skin. A cough rattled from behind the curtain, a deep, wet sound that spoke of advanced illness. "Blake, did you get the medicine?" a voice called out. It was weak, raspy, but Richard would know that voice anywhere. It was the voice that had whispered, "I love you" to him under the stars in a park in 1999. Richard pushed past Blake. He didn't mean to be rude. He was simply drawn by a magnetic force he couldn't resist. He swept the floral curtain aside. Lying in a narrow bed, propped up by thin pillows, was Linda Bennett. She was older now. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and translucent. Oxygen tubes ran into her nose. But her eyes, those warm, hazel eyes, were the same. Linda looked up. Her eyes widened. The magazine she was holding slipped from her fingers. "Rich?" she whispered. It wasn't a scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. Richard fell to his knees beside the bed. He reached out a trembling hand but didn't dare touch her, as if she were a hallucination that would vanish. "Linda. Oh my God. Linda. You're alive." Linda's shock instantly morphed into fury. A sudden, violent strength seized her. She grabbed the glass of water on her bedside table and threw it at him. The water splashed across Richard's face, soaking his expensive shirt. The glass bounced off his chest and shattered on the floor. "Get out!" Linda screamed, her voice breaking into a coughing fit. "Get out of here! How dare you? How dare you come here after 20 years? Mom!" Blake rushed to the bed, grabbing her mother's shoulders. "Mom, calm down. Your heart." "He left us, Blake," Linda sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at the billionaire, kneeling in the shattered glass. "He left us for his money. He paid us off like we were trash, and now he comes back to watch us die?" Richard ignored the water, dripping down his face. He ignored the glass shards digging into his knees. "Paid you off? Linda, what are you talking about? I was told you were dead." The room went silent, save for the hum of the old refrigerator. Linda stopped struggling. She looked at Richard, really looked at him. She saw the raw confusion, the agony in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a man who had abandoned them. It was the look of a man who had been haunting a graveyard. "Dead?" Linda whispered. "Who told you I was dead?" "The police. The lawyers," Richard choked out. "The crash in Oklahoma. They sent me a death certificate. They said you and the baby. They said there were no survivors." Linda shook her head slowly. "I've never been to Oklahoma. I was here, waiting for you. Until I got your letter." "I never wrote you a letter," Richard said firmly. "Blake," Linda said, her voice trembling. "Go to the closet. The shoebox on the top shelf. Bring it here." Blake obeyed, retrieving an old, dusty Nike shoebox. She handed it to her mother. Linda opened it and pulled out a yellowing piece of paper. She threw it at Richard. Richard picked it up. It was typed on his personal stationery from 20 years ago. It read, Asterisk Linda, my life is moving in a different direction. A direction that doesn't include you or the child. Enclosed is a check for $50,000. Take it, leave the city, and never contact me again. If you try to find me, my lawyers will destroy you. Richard stared at the letter. The signature at the bottom looked like his, but he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he hadn't signed it. I didn't write this, Richard said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks after my father's stroke. That's when I lost contact with you. When I got out, I came to your apartment, but it was empty. Then I got the call about the crash. And the check? Blake asked, her voice skeptical. I never cashed it, Linda said softly, looking at her daughter. I tore it up. I wasn't going to sell you, Blake. I raised you on my own. I cleaned floors. I waited tables. I did whatever I had to do so we wouldn't take a dime of his blood money. Richard looked at the two women. The woman he loved, dying in poverty because she had too much pride to take money she thought was a bribe. And his daughter, serving him coffee in a diner, whom he had treated like dirt. A rage began to build in Richard Sterling. It wasn't the petty anger of a man waiting for coffee. It was the volcanic wrath of a man who realizes his entire life has been a lie orchestrated by someone else. Who? Richard asked, standing up. Who gave you this letter? A courier, Linda said. But it was organized by your fiancée. She came to see me a week before the letter arrived. She told me I wasn't good enough for you. She told me I was holding you back. Richard froze. Fiancé? I wasn't engaged then. She said she was, Linda said. Tall, dark hair, very beautiful, very cold. She said her name was Cassandra. The name hit Richard like a bullet. Cassandra, his wife. The woman currently sitting in his mansion, organizing his charity galas, and spending his millions. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside Richard was just beginning. He stood in the hallway of the apartment building, phone to his ear. Arthur, the driver, was standing guard by the door, looking nervously at the gang graffiti on the walls. Get me the file, Richard barked into the phone. The file on the 2001 investments, and the personal correspondence logs from that year. I want them on my desk in an hour. And call Dr. Eris. Tell him to prep the VIP suite at Sterling Memorial Hospital. Sir? His assistant on the other end stammered. It's 9 p.m. Did I stutter? Richard roared. Do it. He hung up and turned back to the apartment door. He took a deep breath, composing his face. He couldn't be the monster anymore. He had to be the father. He walked back inside. Blake was sitting on the bed, holding her mother's hand. They both looked up at him with wary eyes. Pack a bag, Richard said gently. What? Blake stood up defensively. We aren't going anywhere with you. Blake, please, Richard said, his voice cracking. Look at this place. Look at your mother. She needs a doctor. A real doctor. She needs a pulmonologist. She needs clean air. She needs care that. He gestured around the room. That this place can't give her. I can't afford a hospital, Blake said, lifting her chin. You don't have to, Richard said. He took a step closer. I missed 20 years, Blake. I missed your first steps. I missed your first day of school. I missed everything because someone stole you from me. Please. Let me do this. Let me save her. If not for me, then for her. Blake looked at her mother. Linda was pale, her breathing shallow. Blake knew her mom wouldn't survive another winter in this drafty apartment. Okay, Blake whispered. But if you hurt her again, I will kill you. I swear to God. I believe you, Richard said solemnly. And I would deserve it. 3 hours later, Linda was settled into a suite at the city's best hospital, a hospital Richard happened to sit on the board of. The best specialists were already running tests. The prognosis was serious, severe pneumonia, complicated by untreated asthma, but with the best care, she would recover. Blake sat in a plush armchair next to the bed, asleep. She had refused to leave her mother's side. Richard stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline. He could see his own penthouse from here. The lights were on. Cassandra was home. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "This is Detective Miller." A gruff voice answered. "Miller, it's Sterling. I need you to do a job tonight. Off the books." "I'm listening." "I need you to find the death certificate for Linda Bennett from 2001, the one that was sent to my lawyers. I want to know who signed it, who notarized it, and where it came from. And I need you to find the bank records for a check of $50,000 written from my account in June of 2001. Find out if it was cashed or if the funds were diverted. That's cold case stuff, Mr. Sterling. Might take time. You have until morning." "Price is no object." Richard hung up. He looked at his sleeping daughter one last time. He gently placed his suit jacket over her shoulders. "I'll be back," he whispered. "I have to go take out the trash." The elevator ride to the 45th floor took exactly 30 seconds, but to Richard Sterling, it felt like a lifetime. The doors slid open with a soft, polite chime, revealing the foyer of his penthouse, a space that had appeared on the cover of Architectural Digest just last month. It was a sprawling expanse of white marble, glass, and chrome. It was breathtaking. It was expensive. And for the first time, Richard realized exactly what it was. A cage. He stepped out of the elevator. His Italian leather shoes were caked in the grime of the diner's parking lot and the mud from the sidewalk outside Blake's apartment building. He left a trail of dirty, wet footprints across the pristine white Persian rug that cost more than most people earned in a year. "Richard?" The voice drifted from the sunken living room, cool and detached. Cassandra Sterling was lounging on a beige sectional, a glass of Pinot Grigio in one hand and her iPad in the other. At 50, Cassandra was a masterpiece of maintenance. Her hair was a sleek curtain of jet black, her skin pulled tight and smooth by the best surgeons in Switzerland. She was beautiful in the way a diamond is beautiful, hard, sharp, and cold to the touch. "You're late," she said, not bothering to look up from her screen. The zoning commissioner waited for 20 minutes. "I had to tell him you were handling a crisis in the Tokyo market. You owe me an apology. And you owe him a bottle of that 82 Petrus." Richard walked into the room. He didn't speak. He just stood there, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floor, staring at the woman he had shared a bed with for 15 years. Cassandra finally looked up, sensing his presence. Her eyes narrowed as she took in his appearance. "Good God, Richard, look at you. You look like you've been rolling in a gutter. And the rug, do you have any idea how hard it is to get mud out of silk?" "I've been to the Rusty Spoon," Richard said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. Cassandra paused. The stem of her wine glass clicked against her ring, a 10-carat solitaire. A flicker of something crossed her face. Annoyance? Fear? It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her standard mask of bored superiority. "That dump on 4th?" she scoffed. "Why? Did you finally buy it? Please tell me you're bulldozing it tomorrow." "It's an eyesore." "No," Richard said, walking slowly toward the wet bar. He poured himself a whiskey. Neat. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the amber liquid, swirling it around the glass. "I met the waitress." "How charming," Cassandra drawled, turning back to her iPad. "Did she get your order wrong? I imagine competence isn't a requirement for employment there." "She did get the order wrong," Richard said. He turned to face her, leaning back against the bar. "But she got one thing right. She has her mother's eyes, and her mother's chin." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the central air conditioning and the distant wail of a siren far below on the wet streets. Cassandra went very still. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the wine glass. "Linda Bennett," Richard said. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and charged with 20 years of electricity. Cassandra set the glass down on the coffee table a little too hard. Wine sloshed over the rim. "Richard, you're tired. You've been working too hard. You're hallucinating." "Am I?" "Yes," she snapped, standing up and smoothing her silk dress. "That woman died 20 years ago. We have the certificate, Richard. You saw it. You mourned her. You visited her grave. Don't do this to yourself." I visited an empty patch of grass in Ohio, Richard corrected her. And regarding the certificate, do we have it? Or do you have it? This is ridiculous. Cassandra started to walk toward the hallway leading to the master suite. I'm going to bed. When you're sober and have showered off that stench, we can discuss your midlife crisis. Sit down, Richard said. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice an octave. He spoke with the absolute, crushing authority of a man who could level city blocks with a signature. Cassandra froze. She hesitated, her back to him, before slowly turning around. She saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in a decade, the predator. The man who built an empire. She walked back to the sofa and sat down, crossing her arms defensively. Fine, she hissed. Amuse me. I found them, Cassandra. They aren't dead. Linda is alive. She's living in a slum 4 miles from here, dying of pneumonia because she can't afford heat. And I have a daughter, a 23-year-old daughter named Blake. A con artist, Cassandra spat, her lip curling. DNA tests are easy to fake, Richard. These people smell money. You walked in there in a $5,000 suit and they saw a payday. You are a target. I haven't done a DNA test yet, Richard said. But I saw the photo. And I heard the story. A story about a letter, a payoff check for $50,000. And a woman named Cassandra who visited Linda right before I abandoned her. Cassandra laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound, like glass breaking. You think I did this? Richard, please. Back then, I was just your executive assistant. I was managing your schedule, not your love life. I barely knew who you were sleeping with. You were organizing my life. Richard corrected, stepping closer. You were the one who handled my mail when I was in the hospital after my father's stroke. You were the one who screened my calls. You were the one who told me the police called about the crash in Oklahoma. I relayed a message. I don't think you did, Richard said. He was standing over her now, casting a long shadow across the beige sofa. I think you saw an opportunity. You knew my father was dying. You knew I was about to inherit the Sterling Group. But you also knew that if I married Linda, a poor girl with no connections, no pedigree, I would be content. I would be happy. And happy men don't work 80 hours a week. Happy men don't need ambitious wives to help them conquer the social ladder. You're paranoid, Cassandra sneered, though her eyes were darting around the room as if looking for an exit. I called Miller, Richard said softly. The blood drained from Cassandra's face. She knew exactly who Miller was. He was Richard's fixer, the private investigator who dug up dirt on senators and rivals. Miller didn't make mistakes. Miller found the things people thought were buried deep. He's pulling the bank records from 2001, Cass. He's tracking the notary on that death certificate. And you know what he's going to find? He's going to find that the check was drawn from a discretionary account you had access to. He's going to find your fingerprints all over the lie that defined my life. Cassandra stared at him. The mask finally slipped. The cool, sophisticated socialite vanished, and in her place sat a cornered, vicious animal. So what if I did? She whispered. Richard blinked. He had expected denial. He hadn't expected the sheer audacity of the truth. I saved you. Cassandra stood up, screaming now, her voice shrill and manic. You were going to throw it all away for a waitress. You were going to move to the suburbs, buy a minivan, and play house. You were weak, Richard. You had potential, you had genius, but you were distracted by her. She gestured wildly around the penthouse. I made you, Richard. I cleared the path. I got rid of the dead weight so you could focus on building this. Everything you have, the billions, the buildings, the legacy, it's because I made the hard choice. I cut the cord. Dead weight? Richard's voice shook, a tremor of pure rage. That was my family. I am your family. Cassandra shrieked, striking her chest. I have stood by you for 20 years. I managed your image. I hosted your charity galas. I tolerated your moods and your long hours. And now you want to throw me out for some gutter trash and her bastard child? Richard set his whiskey glass down on the table. The heavy crystal made a dull thud. Get out, Richard said. Excuse me? Get out of my house. Get out of my life. You have 1 hour to pack a bag. If you take anything worth more than $5, I will have you arrested for theft." Cassandra stared at him, her mouth agape. Then, a slow, cruel smile spread across her face. She smoothed her dress and sat back down. "You can't kick me out, Richard. We have a prenup. I know it by heart. I get half. I get half of everything. The real estate, the stocks, the art." She laughed, a low, victorious sound. "If you try to divorce me over this, I will bleed you dry. I will take the company. I will destroy your reputation. I will leave you with nothing but your little waitress." Richard smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, Cass, you won't." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. It was a printout his lawyer had emailed him during the ride over. "Clause 14, Section B of our prenuptial agreement," Richard recited from memory. "In the event of criminal misconduct committed by one party against the other, or fraud regarding the inception of the marriage, all assets remain with the injured party." Cassandra's smug smile faltered. "Forging a death certificate is a felony," Richard said quietly. "Intercepting federal mail is a felony. Extorting my child's mother, that's fraud. You didn't just break the law, Cassandra. You broke the contract. You don't get half. You don't get the house. You don't even get alimony." He checked his Rolex. "You have 55 minutes left. Detective Miller is currently downstairs with the police. They are coming up to take a formal statement regarding the fraud and the forgery. I suggest you be gone before the elevator doors open again. I can't promise they won't put you in cuffs." Cassandra stared at him. She looked at the luxury around her, the life she had stolen, the life she had killed for. She looked at Richard, the man she had molded, and realized she had molded him too well. She had made him ruthless. And now, that ruthlessness was turned on her. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She ran. She grabbed her purse, abandoning the iPad and the wine. She didn't even pack a bag. The sound of her expensive heels clicking frantically on the marble floor echoed through the vast, empty apartment. She hit the elevator button repeatedly, panic seizing her features. When the doors opened, she threw herself inside. The doors closed, and Cassandra Sterling was gone. Richard was alone. The penthouse was quiet. For 20 years, this silence had felt oppressive, a reminder of his isolation. But tonight, the silence felt clean. It felt like the air after a thunderstorm. He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in a small, drafty room, were the only two things that actually mattered. He pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking, not from rage, but from relief. He dialed the number for the hospital room. "Hello?" Blake's voice answered after 2 rings, groggy and whispered. "Blake," Richard said, his voice cracking as the facade of the billionaire finally crumbled, leaving just a man. It's Dad. I'm coming back, and I'm going to fix everything." 6 months had passed since the storm that threatened to drown them all, and Seattle, for once, had decided to be merciful. The gray, weeping clouds that usually strangled the skyline had parted, revealing a brilliant, golden afternoon. The sunlight hit the wet pavement of 4th and Pine, turning the puddles into mirrors that reflected a city reborn. On the corner, where the construction barriers had once loomed like prison walls, the sidewalk was now clear. The threat of the Sterling Heights, that glass and steel monstrosity Richard had planned to erect, was gone. In its place stood the building that had started it all, though it hardly looked like the same structure. The crumbling brick had been tuck-pointed and sealed. The grimy windows were replaced with crystal-clear panes that invited the world in. Above the door, the neon sign buzzed with a vibrant, welcoming hum. The letters crisp and bright, the rusty spoon. Inside, the transformation was even more miraculous. The air no longer smelled of stale grease and despair. It carried the rich, roasted aroma of premium coffee beans and the savory scent of fresh herbs sizzling on a flat-top grill. The checkerboard floors gleamed under the warm pendant lights. The vinyl booths, once taped together with duct tape, were reupholstered in a deep, retro red leather that squeaked softly when you sat. Blake Bennett moved through the dining room like a dancer. She balanced a tray of steaming lattes, and gourmet sandwiches with an easy grace that replaced her old, frantic shuffle. The dark circles that had once bruised the skin under her eyes had vanished, replaced by a healthy flush. She wore a uniform, but it was crisp, tailored, and commanded respect. She wasn't just working here anymore. She owned the place. "Order up for table 4, boss," Frank yelled from the kitchen. The old man, who had spent years guarding his grill with a scowl, was now wearing a pristine white chef's coat. He looked 10 years younger. Energized by the kitchen renovation and the retirement-worthy salary he was now earning as the head chef. "Coming, Frank," Blake called back, her voice light and musical. She swung by the pass, grabbed the plates, and walked toward the center booth, the best seat in the house. Sitting there was a man who, 6 months ago, wouldn't have been caught dead in a diner without a demolition crew behind him. Richard Sterling was wearing a soft navy polo shirt and beige chinos. The armored suit was gone. The Rolex was still there, but he checked it far less often. The deep furrows of stress that used to carve his forehead had softened, smoothed out by a peace he hadn't known existed. Next to him sat Linda. The transformation in her was nothing short of a medical miracle. The best specialists at Sterling Memorial had treated her aggressive pneumonia and managed her asthma with cutting-edge care. She had gained weight, her cheeks filling out to frame her smile. She was laughing at something Richard was saying, her hand resting gently on his forearm, a touch that bridged a 20-year chasm. Richard watched Blake approach, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It hadn't been an easy road to get to this booth. The DNA test had been a mere formality. The results were 99.999% positive, but the real work had been the reconstruction of a shattered trust. Richard remembered the first month vividly. He had tried to fix things the only way he knew how, with a checkbook. He had bought Blake a brand new Porsche, parking it in front of their crumbling apartment building with a big red bow. Blake had walked out, looked at the car, and thrown the keys back at him. "I don't need a status symbol to drive me to a minimum wage life, Dad," she had told him, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't want your money. I want to know who you are. I want a father, not an ATM." It was a lesson that hit Richard harder than any market crash. Then came the battle over housing. He had insisted they move into his penthouse, thinking the luxury would woo them. Linda had stood in the marble foyer of his sky-high fortress, looked at the cold, museum-like furniture, and shook her head. "This isn't a home, Rich," she had said gently. "It's a mausoleum to your ego. It's cold. We can't heal here." So, Richard compromised. He did the unthinkable. He sold the penthouse. He bought a warm, sprawling craftsman house in Queen Anne, with a garden where Linda could plant hydrangeas, and a porch where they could watch the rain. And regarding the diner, he didn't bulldoze it. He bought the building from Frank at triple the market value and handed the deed to Blake. He financed the renovation, kept Frank on as a salaried partner, and gave Blake a 51% controlling stake. "Your coffee, sir," Blake said, placing the mug down on the table with a playful, exaggerated clink. She raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on her lips. "Careful. I brewed it myself. It might be that sludge you were so worried about." Richard chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest. He picked up the mug and took a long, deliberate sip. "Best sludge in the city," he declared. "I'll have you know I fired my personal barista last week." The man didn't understand the complexity of a good diner roast. "You fired him because he put oat milk in your espresso without asking," Linda teased, nudging him. "Details." Richard waved a hand dismissively. He looked up at Blake, his expression softening into pure admiration. "The place looks incredible, Blake. You're running a tight ship. Every table is full." "We're booked out for lunch service all week," Blake said proudly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Frank's new pot roast special is a hit. Who knew people actually liked real food?" "I knew," Richard said softly. "I just forgot." He watched her for a moment longer, the way she interacted with the customers. The kindness she showed to the homeless veteran in the corner booth who was enjoying his soup. The confidence in her posture. She had done this. He had provided the capital, yes, but the heart? That was all her. "You did good, Rich," Linda whispered, squeezing his hand. "I didn't do anything," Richard murmured, shaking his head. "She did it all herself. I just finally got out of her way." You came back, Linda corrected him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. That's what matters. You showed up. Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. He reached into his pocket and felt the cool, smooth metal of the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. The same pen he had used to write that venomous note 6 months ago. The same pen that Blake had tried to return to him in the rain. Blake? He called out gently. Blake turned from the counter and walked back over. Everything okay? Sandwich too stale? Bread tastes like a dumpster? Perfection. Actually. Richard smiled, though his eyes were glistening. Check, please. Blake pulled the pad from her apron and printed the slip. She placed it on the table. The total was $14.50. Richard picked up the receipt. He uncapped the gold pen. He didn't rush. He savored the weight of the pen in his hand. He signed his name at the bottom, but he added a title he was more proud of than CEO or chairman. Richard Sterling, Dad. Then, his hand hovered over the tip line. He didn't write a zero. He didn't write $1 million. He didn't want to make a spectacle. He wanted to make a statement. On the tip line, he wrote 3 words, paid in full. And underneath, in the blank space, where he had once written an insult that broke his daughter's heart, he wrote a new message in his rigorous, sharp cursive. Service is a skill. You have it. But your forgiveness? That's a miracle. I love you. To Engspersent. He placed the pen on the receipt and stood up. Blake picked up the slip. She read the note. Her breath hitched, and she looked up at him, his blue eyes swimming with tears. Richard opened his arms. Blake didn't hesitate. She stepped into his embrace, burying her face in his shoulder. It wasn't the stiff, awkward hug of a stranger. It was a fierce, desperate cling. He held her tight, smelling the coffee and vanilla on her uniform, grateful for every single second of this second chance he knew he didn't deserve. See you at dinner tonight? Blake asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. Mom's making lasagna. Her secret recipe. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Richard said, kissing the top of her head. I'll bring the wine. The cheap stuff, obviously. I don't want to spoil the palate. Blake laughed, pulling back and wiping her eyes. Get out of here, old man. I have customers waiting. Richard grabbed his jacket and held the door open for Linda. As they stepped out onto the sidewalk, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the Seattle sky in strokes of violet and burning gold. The air was crisp and clean. At the curb, the black Mercedes Maybach was idling. Arthur, the driver, stood by the open rear door, ready to whisk them away in climate-controlled silence. Richard stopped. He looked at the car. It looked like a hearse. Actually, Arthur, Richard said, waving his hand, you can go home early today. Take the rest of the night off. Arthur blinked, confused. Sir? But how will you get to the Queen Anne house? It's 12 blocks, and it's uphill. Richard looked at Linda. She smiled and squeezed his hand. I know, Richard said, buttoning his jacket. I've got a lot of catching up to do. Walking seems like a good place to start. He took his wife's hand. He turned his back on the luxury car, on the symbol of the lonely empire he had built. Together, Richard and Linda walked down the street, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the city. Richard Sterling had lost a few $1 million in the last 6 months. He had lost his penthouse. He had lost his shark-like reputation. But as he walked up the hill with the woman he loved, thinking about the lasagna dinner waiting for him with his daughter, he realized the truth. He was finally, truly, a wealthy man. Richard Sterling thought his wallet held his wealth, but it actually held his biggest regret. It took losing his pride to find his family. This story reminds us that the people we treat poorly today might be the ones we need the most tomorrow. Richard was given a second chance, but not everyone gets that lucky. So, the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their job or their clothes, remember, you never know the full story. What would you have done if you were Blake? Would you have forgiven him after 20 years? Or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder of what really matters, and subscribe for more stories that that reveal the truth about human nature. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.